The clock had just struck midnight when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. At first, Mike thought it was just another car passing by on the empty highway, but the siren's short whoop made his heart skip a beat. He carefully pulled his pride and joy, a beautifully restored 1967 Mustang, onto the shoulder of the road. The night air was crisp and clear, carrying the sound of gravel crunching under boots as two officers approached his car. Mike rolled down his window, the familiar smell of leather interior mixing with the cool breeze. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him years ago. License and registration, the first officer said, flashlight beam sweeping across the car's interior. The light lingered on the custom dashboard, the modified gauges gleaming under its harsh glare. Mike noticed the officer's eyes narrow slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mike asked, keeping his voice steady despite the growing unease in his stomach. He'd been pulled over before in regular cars, but this was different. The way the officers were looking at his Mustang made him nervous. "Your car matches the description of a vehicle involved in illegal street racing activities in this area," the second officer explained, walking slowly around the car. His flashlight beam traced every curve and modification of the classic vehicle. "These street racers have been causing serious problems lately." Mike's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The car was his baby. He'd spent 3 years restoring it, pouring his heart, soul, and savings into every detail. Yes, he'd made some modifications, but everything was legal. Or at least, that's what he could tell them. "There must be some mistake," Mike said, reaching for his paperwork. "I'm just heading home from work. I'm not involved in any racing." He pulled out his registration and license, trying to ignore how his hands trembled slightly. There were things about this car, important things, that he couldn't explain to these officers. The first officer studied Mike's paperwork with growing suspicion. "These documents seem irregular," he said slowly, shining his flashlight directly on the papers. "And these window tints appear darker than the legal limit." Mike's throat went dry. He knew exactly why certain details in his paperwork didn't quite add up, but he couldn't say a word about it. Not here, not now. Everything he'd worked for could unravel with a single wrong word. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the second officer commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The friendly atmosphere of the initial stop had evaporated completely. As Mike carefully opened his door and stepped onto the asphalt, he could see his reflection in the car's polished surface. He looked calm on the outside, but inside, his mind was racing. Years of training had taught him how to handle situations like this, but nothing had prepared him for watching his beloved car become the center of police suspicion. The officers' suspicious glances turned into pointed questions. Why were the engine modifications so extensive? What was the purpose of the custom wiring? Who had done the work on the car? With each question, Mike could only provide the most basic answers, knowing that the truth had to remain hidden, even as he watched his situation spiral further out of control. Standing there under the harsh streetlight, with his cherished Mustang under scrutiny and his carefully constructed world beginning to crack, Mike realized this traffic stop was just the beginning of what would become the most challenging night of his life. What he didn't know yet was that his silence would cost him far more than he could imagine. Things went from bad to worse when the officers brought out their flashlights and began inspecting every inch of the car. The taller officer crouched down, running his beam along the undercarriage, while his partner kept a watchful eye on Mike, who stood helplessly by the side of the road. "Look at these modifications," the officer called out from beneath the car. "This isn't your average restoration job." He slid out and stood up, brushing dirt from his uniform. "The whole underside's been reinforced. You don't do that unless you're planning something." Mike's heart pounded against his ribs. He knew exactly why those modifications were there, but revealing the truth would blow everything. 2 years of careful work, countless hours of building trust, all of it would crumble if he spoke up now. So he stayed quiet, even as the situation slipped further from his control. "Sir, your paperwork shows some inconsistencies," the second officer said, flipping through the documents under his flashlight. "The VIN number doesn't match our database records, and these registration papers look—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unusual." A cold breeze whipped across the highway, but Mike barely felt it. His mind raced through his options, each one worse than the last. He could feel this carefully constructed cover story starting to unravel like an old sweater. Pull one thread, and the whole thing would come apart. "Officer, I can explain," Mike started, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew he couldn't. Not really. Not without making a phone call that would change everything. His hands instinctively moved toward his pocket where his special phone lay hidden, the one with the direct line to his handlers. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the first officer commanded, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Mike slowly raised his hands, his heart sinking. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 247. What's your status?" "Unit 247. We've got a suspicious vehicle, possible connection to the racing ring. Requesting backup for a thorough search. Something's not right here." Mike watched as more patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the night in alternating red and blue. Each new set of headlights felt like another nail in the coffin of his operation. He thought about the hidden compartments in the car, the sophisticated equipment carefully concealed within its frame, all the secrets he was sworn to protect. One of the newly arrived officers approached with a K-9 unit. The dog's ears were perked forward, alert and ready to work. Mike knew the dog would pick up on something. The car was designed to hide things after all. Just not the things these officers were looking for. "Sir, given the inconsistencies in your paperwork and the suspicious modifications to your vehicle, we're going to impound your car for further investigation," the first officer announced. "You have the right to remain silent." As the officer continued reading his rights, Mike watched a tow truck's headlights appear in the distance. His mind flashed the countless hours he'd spent restoring the Mustang, choosing it specifically because it would blend in with the racing scene. Now that same careful planning was backfiring spectacularly. The tow truck driver backed up to the Mustang, chains rattling in the night air. Each metallic clank felt like a physical blow to Mike's chest. He wanted to speak up, to explain, to make a single phone call that would stop all of this. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. The operation was bigger than him, bigger than his car. Standing there in the cold night air, watching as his beloved car was chained up like a criminal, Mike realized he was crossing a point of no return. Whatever happened next would change everything. His mission, his career, and maybe even his life. The only question was, how much would this night end up costing him? The police station's impound lot was a graveyard of vehicles, each one telling its own story of bad luck or bad decisions. Mike watched from behind a chain-link fence as they rolled his Mustang into a covered inspection area. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the car's glossy paint, making it look almost alien. Nothing like the beloved vehicle he'd spent countless hours restoring. "We've got the warrant," one of the officers announced, waving a piece of paper. The words hit Mike like a physical blow. He knew what came next. They were going to tear his car apart, piece by piece, looking for evidence of street racing modifications. But they'd find something else entirely. The lead detective approached Mike, who was still standing by the fence. "Look, make this easier on yourself. If you're involved with the racing ring, now's the time to talk. We can work something out." His voice was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. Mike shook his head slowly. "I wish I could explain," he said quietly, watching as a team of mechanics began their inspection. His fingers curled around the cold metal of the fence. Each turn of a wrench, each pop of a panel being removed, felt like they were dismantling his life piece by piece. The first red flag came when they found the reinforced panels. not illegal on their own, but suspicious enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the discovery of the modified fuel system. Again, nothing explicitly illegal, but not something you'd find on a regular restored classic car. What do we have here? One of the mechanics called out, his voice echoing across the lot. He found one of the hidden compartments, the ones designed by people way above Mike's pay grade, the ones that held secrets he was sworn to protect. The detective's expression hardened. "Pop it open," he ordered. Mike closed his eyes for a moment, knowing what they'd find, or rather, what they wouldn't find. The compartments were empty now, but their very existence would be enough to convince them they were dealing with something bigger than street racing. Hours passed like molasses. Mike remained standing, despite offers of a chair. His legs ached, but moving felt like giving up. Each new discovery brought more questions, more suspicious glances, more certainty that they'd stumbled onto something big. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn when they found the sophisticated wiring system. It snaked through the car's frame, a complex web that had nothing to do with racing and everything to do with why Mike couldn't explain himself. "This isn't amateur work," one of the mechanics muttered, tracing a bundle of wires. "This is professional-grade stuff. Military spec, maybe." The detective turned to Mike again, his earlier friendliness completely gone. "You want to explain this? Because right now, we're way past street racing. This is looking more like—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "something else entirely." Mike stayed silent, watching as they continued their methodical destruction of his car. Each removed panel, each disconnected wire, represented hours of work, not just his, but the work of an entire team who'd turned this Mustang into something more than just a car. The morning shift was arriving now, fresh faces mixing with the tired officers who'd been there all night. Mike could hear their whispered conversations, see their pointing fingers. His car had become the center of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. Standing there in the growing light of dawn, Mike realized he was approaching a breaking point. Soon, very soon, he'd have to make a choice. Maintain his cover and watch them destroy his car completely, or make the call that would save his car, but potentially compromise everything he'd worked for. The sound of metal grinding against metal drew his attention back to the inspection area. They were about to start on the engine block. Once they began that process, there would be no going back. The choice was no longer about just his car. It was about everything he'd sacrificed for over the past 2 years. The mechanical whine of power tools filled the air as the inspection team began their deeper dive into the Mustang's secrets. What had started as a simple search was turning into a complete teardown. Mike watched as they removed the custom dashboard, revealing the first major surprise hidden beneath. "Chief, you need to see this," called one of the mechanics, his voice tight with excitement. He pointed his flashlight into the cavity behind the dashboard, illuminating a maze of sophisticated electronics that had no business being in a classic car. The police chief walked over, coffee cup in hand, and peered into the opening. His eyebrows shot up as he took in the sight. "Those aren't aftermarket racing mods," he said slowly. "This is something else entirely." The discovery sent a fresh wave of activity through the garage. More officers crowded around, their voices a mix of confusion and speculation. They'd expected to find evidence of illegal street racing, nitrous oxide systems, engine modifications, maybe some illegal performance chips. Instead, they were finding technology that looked more suited to a spy movie than a street racer's garage. "Look at this craftsmanship," one of the mechanics said, carefully tracing a wire bundle with his finger. "This isn't backyard work. These are military-grade connections, professional installation." He looked up at Mike, who remained silent by the wall. "Who are you really?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mike kept his face neutral, even as his stomach churned. He'd known this moment might come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. Each new discovery pushed him closer to the edge of a decision he didn't want to make. The search continued, becoming more aggressive with each new find. They discovered hidden compartments in the doors, specially designed to be invisible to normal inspections. The trunk held another surprise, a false bottom that concealed a sophisticated communication system, now carefully removed and laid out on a workbench. "This isn't just suspicious anymore," the chief said, examining the equipment. "This is professional-grade surveillance gear, the kind that requires permits, the kind that raises serious questions." He turned to Mike. "Questions that need answers." Mike shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his legs stiff from standing for so many hours. He watched as they began working on the engine compartment, knowing what they would find there would only raise more questions. Sure enough, the engine itself was a masterpiece of deception. What looked like a perfectly restored classic Mustang power plant was actually housing some of the most sophisticated tracking and surveillance equipment available. The kind of setup that cost more than the car itself many times over. "Nobody goes to this much trouble just to hide from street racing charges," one officer muttered, photographing each new discovery. "This is bigger. Much bigger." The chief made a phone call, speaking in low tones. Mike could catch fragments of the conversation. Words like federal and jurisdiction that made his heart rate spike. They were getting closer to the truth, but not in the way they thought. The morning sun now streamed through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the partially dismantled Mustang. What had started as a normal traffic stop had turned into something that would soon be beyond the local police department's control. A new group of officers arrived, wearing different uniforms. They began setting up special equipment around the car, preparing for an even more detailed search. Mike knew what they were looking for: signs of drugs, weapons, anything that might explain the car's mysterious modifications. But they wouldn't find any of that. What they would find, if they kept looking, was something far more complicated. Something that would change everything, not just for Mike, but for everyone involved in this increasingly complex situation. As they prepared to completely dismantle the engine block, Mike realized his time for staying silent was running out. The sun was high in the sky when Mike's hidden phone vibrated in his boot. 3 short pulses, the signal he'd been dreading. His handlers had somehow found out about the situation. Of course they had. They always knew everything. Through the garage windows, he could see people in suits arriving, parking their unmarked cars at careful distances from each other. They weren't local police. Their movements were too precise, their expressions too controlled. These were federal agents, here to contain the situation. Inside the garage, the mechanics were still working on the Mustang, unaware of what was about to unfold. They'd removed most of the engine now, laying out parts on clean shop towels with the kind of care that would have made Mike grateful under different circumstances. "Got something else," one mechanic called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. He'd found the hidden compartment behind the firewall, the one that housed the most sensitive equipment, the one that would raise the most questions. The chief walked over to inspect the discovery, but before he could get there, the garage doors opened. The suited figures Mike had spotted earlier walked in, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet space. The chief turned, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "This operation is now under federal jurisdiction," announced one of the agents, holding up a badge. "All work stops immediately. Step away from the vehicle." The mechanics looked at each other, then at the chief, uncertain. The local officers tensed, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. The air grew thick with tension. Under whose authority? The chief demanded, finding his voice. "This is our investigation. We've got a potential major crime ring here." The lead agent's face remained neutral. "That's classified information, Chief. But I can tell you this vehicle and its owner are part of an ongoing federal investigation. One you've unknowingly compromised." Mike watched the chief's face redden. 2 years of work were hanging by a thread, and he could see his handlers trying to salvage what they could. But he knew it was too late. Too many people had seen too much. One of the other agents approached Mike, speaking quietly. "The operation's blown. Too many local forces involved now. We're switching to plan B. She pressed a small key into his palm, the key to his handcuffs. A second later, she was gone, lost in the growing crowd of federal agents filling the garage. The chief was still arguing with the lead agent, his voice rising. You can't just walk in here and shut down our investigation. We've got evidence of sophisticated surveillance equipment, hidden compartments. Chief, the agent cut him off. I suggest you look at these papers. Carefully. He handed over a thick envelope. After you read them, you'll understand why this conversation is over. Mike watched as the chief's face changed while reading the documents. The anger faded, replaced by something between surprise and resignation. He looked up at Mike, seeing him properly for the first time. Around them, federal agents were already packing up the dismantled car parts, documenting everything with quick photographs before storing them in special containers. The local officers stood back, their earlier confidence deflated by the sudden turn of events. The secret phone vibrated again in Mike's boot, one long pulse this time. The signal to get ready. His part in this operation was ending, but not in the way anyone had planned. 2 years of undercover work, building trust with some very dangerous people, all of it compromised because of one traffic stop. As federal agents continued to swarm the garage, Mike realized this was more than just about his car now. The operation would have to change completely. New plans, new identities, new approaches. The people they were investigating would have heard about this incident by nightfall. The chief walked over to Mike, still holding the papers. You could have said something, he said quietly. Mike shook his head. No, sir. I really couldn't. The garage had turned into something that looked like a scene from a movie. Federal agents in dark suits were everywhere, some packing equipment, others taking photos, and a few huddled in corners having intense conversations on their phones. The local police officers stood to the side, looking like they weren't sure if they should be embarrassed or angry. Then the door opened, and everyone turned to look. A man walked in wearing a crisp suit that somehow looked different from the others. He carried himself with the kind of authority that made everyone else stand a little straighter. This was clearly someone important. I'm the special agent in charge, he announced, his voice carrying across the garage. He held up a badge that made the chief's eyes widen. And that car you've been taking apart. That's a $3 million piece of federal surveillance equipment. The mechanics who'd been working on the Mustang looked at their tools like they'd suddenly turned into snakes. One of them actually took a step back from the car, as if it might bite him. This vehicle and its operator are part of a 2-year undercover operation targeting one of the largest money laundering operations on the East Coast, the special agent continued. An operation that's now compromised because someone thought they'd found the street racer. Mike watched as understanding dawned on everyone's faces. The chief looked like he'd swallowed something sour. The mechanics were staring at the dismantled car parts with new respect and more than a little fear. Those modifications you found. The special agent walked over to one of the hidden compartments they'd exposed. This isn't street racing equipment. This is cutting-edge surveillance technology. The kind that costs more than most people make in a decade. He picked up one of the components they'd removed from behind the dashboard. This single piece of equipment could pay for a year of your department's budget, Chief. And your team has spent the night taking it apart. The garage was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Mike could see the local officers processing what this meant. All night, they'd thought they'd been closing in on a street racing ring. Instead, they'd been dismantling federal property and potentially compromising a major investigation. Our operative couldn't tell you who he really was, the special agent explained, gesturing toward Mike. He's been deep undercover, building trust with people who would kill him without hesitation if they knew his real identity. He did exactly what he was trained to do, protect his cover at all costs. One of the mechanics raised his hand nervously. Sir? About the damage we caused. His voice trailed off as he looked at the parts scattered around the garage. The special agent's expression softened slightly. You were doing your job, just like our operative was doing his. But this incident is going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money and potentially set our investigation back months. Mike finally felt like he could breathe properly for the first time since being pulled over. His cover wasn't completely blown. The local police had kept things quiet enough that word probably hadn't spread to his targets. But his car, his carefully crafted tool for infiltrating the money laundering ring, was in pieces. "What happens now?" the chief asked, looking both concerned and embarrassed. The special agent surveyed the garage. "Now, everyone in this room signs non-disclosure agreements. This incident never happened. The car was never here. And our operative," he glanced at Mike, "was never here either." Mike watched as federal agents began distributing papers to everyone present. The local officers and mechanics signed without hesitation, now fully understanding the gravity of what they'd stumbled into. The chief approached Mike, holding out his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We were just trying to clean up our streets. Never thought we'd stumble into something this big." Mike shook his hand, speaking for the first time in hours. "You were doing your job, sir, just like I was doing mine." The next few days felt like walking through a fog. Mike sat in endless meetings with his supervisors, explaining every detail of that night over and over again. Each time he told the story, someone new was in the room, taking notes and asking questions. "Your cover isn't completely blown," his direct supervisor told him during one of these meetings. "But we can't risk using that car again. Too many local officers saw it. Word gets around, even with the non-disclosure agreements." The loss of the Mustang hit harder than Mike expected. He'd spent countless hours working on that car, making it perfect for his role. Every modification, every hidden compartment, every careful detail had been part of his identity in the underworld he'd infiltrated. The department's insurance adjusters are having a field day with this one, another agent mentioned, flipping through a thick stack of papers. $3 million in equipment, plus the car itself. The local police department's facing some serious questions from their higher-ups. Mike thought about the mechanics who had worked on his car that night. They'd just been doing their jobs, trying to catch street racers who'd been causing problems in their town. Instead, they'd stumbled into something much bigger than they could have imagined. The tension between the federal agency and local police didn't help matters. Both sides were pointing fingers, trying to avoid blame for the incident. The local police claimed they should have been informed about federal operations in their jurisdiction. The federal agency argued that sharing that information would have risked the entire operation. "We've got another problem," his supervisor said during a private meeting. "The people you've been investigating, they're going to notice you disappeared for a night. We need a cover story that explains where you were without raising suspicions." Mike had already thought about this. In his world, disappearing for a night usually meant one of two things: you were dead or you were talking to the police. He needed a third option, something that would actually help his cover instead of destroying it. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the local officers who'd been there that night approached Mike's supervisor with an idea. They could leak certain details about the traffic stop, just enough to make it look like the local police had harassed an innocent car enthusiast without discovering anything important. "It's actually perfect," Mike's supervisor said, warming to the idea. "The local police get to save face by claiming they were just doing routine checks. You get a story that makes you look like a victim of police harassment, which will only help your credibility with the targets." They'd put the plan into action carefully. The right rumors were allowed to spread. A few carefully chosen details about the traffic stop made their way through the local car community. The story grew and changed as it spread, becoming something that actually helped Mike's cover instead of destroying it. The mechanics who'd worked on the car that night were offered jobs with the federal agency. Their skills and attention to detail had impressed the right people, even if they had been taking apart the wrong car. The local police chief took early retirement a few months later. Nobody said it was because of the incident, but everyone knew. His replacement was someone who understood the importance of interagency cooperation. As for Mike's beloved Mustang, it was quietly transported to a secure facility. The car that had been his home away from home for 2 years would never see the streets again. But somewhere in a government warehouse, under a dusty cover, it stood as a testament to one of the strangest nights in local law enforcement history. 3 weeks after the incident, Mike was back on the streets in a different car. This one wasn't as flashy as his Mustang, but it had its own character. A slightly beaten-up Challenger that looked like it had seen better days. Perfect for someone who'd supposedly had a run-in with overeager cops. The story of his traffic stop had spread through the underground racing scene exactly as planned. People looked at him differently now, with a mix of sympathy and respect. Nothing earned trust in his world quite like being hassled by the police and coming out clean. Heard they tore your ride apart, one of his target's lieutenants said during a late-night meeting. Cops around here getting too bold, thinking they can mess with honest businessmen. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Mike. The federal agency had turned the whole incident into an advantage. They used it as a wake-up call to review their procedures for undercover operations. New protocols were put in place. Better communication channels were established with local law enforcement. Sometimes the best lessons came from the biggest mistakes. During a routine check-in with his supervisor, Mike learned something interesting. The mechanics who'd worked on his Mustang that night had finished their training. They were now part of the agency's technical team, using their skills to build the next generation of surveillance vehicles. "Your car taught us a lot," his supervisor explained. "Those mechanics found weaknesses in our design we hadn't noticed. Sometimes you need fresh eyes looking at a problem." The local police department had gone through changes too. The new chief was young, forward-thinking. He'd set up special training sessions for his officers about federal operations. Without revealing any specific details about Mike's case, they taught their officers what to look for and, more importantly, when to make a quiet phone call before taking action. But the biggest surprise came during a meeting with the agency's top brass. They'd reviewed everything that happened that night, from the initial traffic stop to the final resolution. Instead of finding fault, they saw opportunity. "Your handling of the situation was textbook," the senior agent told Mike. "You maintained your cover under pressure, didn't break character even when they were dismantling your car. That's the kind of dedication we need more of." The agency decided to turn the whole incident into a training scenario. Of course, they changed the names and some details, but the core story, an undercover operative maintaining their cover while watching their car being torn apart, became part of their training program. The money laundering investigation continued, now stronger than ever. Mike's supposed run-in with the police had actually opened new doors. People who'd been cautious around him before now saw him as one of their own, someone who'd stood up to police harassment and kept his mouth shut. One evening, as Mike was leaving a meeting with his targets, he drove past the garage where they'd taken apart his Mustang. The lights were on, and he could see mechanics working on regular cars, probably dealing with normal problems like broken timing belts and worn-out brakes. The sight made him smile. Those mechanics had no idea how that one night had changed so many lives. They'd started their shift thinking they were busting a street racer and ended up launching new careers with a federal agency. As for the local police officers who'd been there that night, they'd learned a valuable lesson about appearances being deceiving. The next time they pulled over a car that seemed a little too perfect, a little too modified, they might think twice before tearing it apart. 6 months later, Mike stood in a crowded courtroom, looking at the faces of the people he'd spent 2 years investigating. The money laundering ring's leaders sat at the defendant's table, their expensive suits and confident smirks replaced by prison jumpsuits and worried frowns. What they didn't know was how their own suspicions had helped bring them down. After that night with the police, when Mike's Mustang had been torn apart, the gang had done their own investigation. They'd heard about the police finding nothing in his car, about how he'd kept quiet during the whole ordeal. It had been the final proof they needed. If he'd been a cop, surely something would have turned up. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," the prosecutor said as Mike took the stand. For the first time in over 2 years, he said his real name out loud, adding "Special Agent" before it. He heard the sharp intake of breath from the defendants, saw the moment of realization hit them. That night, when the local police stopped my car, it could have ended the operation, Mike testified, looking directly at his former associates. Instead, it helped me get closer to the organization. They trusted me more after that, thinking I'd proven myself. The evidence was overwhelming. Mike's testimony was just the final nail in the coffin. His careful work, backed by hundreds of hours of surveillance recordings and financial records, had exposed one of the largest money laundering operations on the East Coast. Over $50 million in illegal transactions, all documented and traced. After the verdict came in, guilty on all counts, Mike's supervisor pulled him aside. "Remember that compensation money from the police department for damaging the Mustang? It just came through. The chief wanted you to have this personally." He handed Mike an envelope. Inside was a check, but also a letter from the retired police chief. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest successes," it read. "Your sacrifice that night helped us catch some really bad people. Thank you for your service." The amount was more than enough to buy and restore another classic car. Mike already had his eye on a '69 Charger that needed some love. This time, though, it would just be a regular car, no hidden compartments, no surveillance equipment, just pure American muscle the way it was meant to be. A few weeks later, Mike drove past his old haunts in his new project car. The streets where he'd spent 2 years playing a role now looked different. The garages where he'd carefully built his cover story were just garages again. The late-night spots where he'd gathered intelligence were back to being regular hangouts. He stopped at a traffic light and saw a police cruiser pull up beside him. The officer glanced over, probably checking out the classic car. Mike gave a friendly wave, and the officer waved back. No suspicion, no tension. Just 2 car guys sharing a moment of appreciation. The light turned green, and Mike drove on, thinking about how one traffic stop had changed so many lives. The mechanics who'd become federal technicians, the police officers who'd learned valuable lessons about appearances, and even the criminals who'd been caught partly because they trusted the wrong person for the right reasons. As he pulled into his driveway, Mike ran his hand along the Charger's fender. This car would never be torn apart in a police garage, would never carry secret surveillance equipment, would never be part of an undercover operation. It would just be what it appeared to be. A classic car, loved and restored by someone who appreciated it for what it was. Sometimes, he thought, that's all anything needs to be.